Hi everybody, Andrew Cuneo here. Today I'm going to be going over the latest banned and restricted announcement. There's a ton of stuff to talk about, so let's go ahead and dive into it. First of all, there's 3 changes to standard. Alrund's Epiphany's banned, Divide by Zero's banned, Faceless Haven's banned. So I think the goal here is pretty obvious. They want to get rid of the Alrund's Epiphany decks. They don't want people to just play against the same blue-red control decks over and over. In addition to hitting Epiphany, which gets rid of them, they wanted to get rid of Divide by Zero because that leads to some pretty annoying play patterns where people just wind up casting the same spell over and over to no effect because it keeps getting bounced back to your hand. So obviously a pretty big hit to blue decks. There's still some very good tools if you want to build a control deck. They didn't touch Hullbreaker Horror. They didn't touch Leer. So there's still plenty of good things to do as a blue player. There's also still expressive iteration. So I think we'll just be able to see the blue decks move in a different direction from Alrund's Epiphany. It's not clear they're going to be the best decks, but they're certainly still viable. Faceless Haven was banned, which is just a direct nerf to mono green and mono white, and that's fine. Those were the second and third strongest decks in Standard, I would say, the last time I played it. And having a hit to those is fine. The one card that I found really strange that wasn't banned was Asika's Chariot, which I know hasn't been, an oppressively good card in the best deck, but it is, in Standard, without question, the best thing you can spend 4 mana on if you're a mid-range deck. And I think if you're nerfing the aggro decks by getting rid of Faceless Haven, and you're nerfing the big blue mana decks by getting rid of Alrund's Epiphany, then you're hoping that more of the action is happening in the mid-range area. And Asika's Chariot, it's just so much better than everything else. I'm not going to play Standard until Kamigawa Neon Destiny comes out. I'm just not very interested in it. I might try it again when Neon Destiny comes out. I might just stick with Alchemy and Historic, to be honest. But if I want to look at the spoiler for Kamigawa Neon Destiny for cards that stand out to me as something that could be interesting in Standard, I just have a really hard time imagining there's going to be many 4 or 5 mana cards that I'm going to look at and I'm going to say, yeah, that's a card I would put in my deck instead of playing Asika's Chariot. So I don't really understand what the Chariot's still doing in the format. I mean, Standard was a completely dead format to me, so maybe these changes make it more interesting to people. I'm not going to play it until Neon Destiny. I might never play it even then, to be honest. So not the biggest changes for me. Hopefully people are still playing Standard, find it enjoyable. And Legacy, they banned Ragavan. To be honest, I don't even know what Ragavan does. I haven't played in any of the formats that it's legal in since it was printed, so I can't really comment on that. Historic, they moved Memory Lapse from the suspended list to the banned list finally. I think everybody knew that was going to happen. It was banned. It was suspended in October 21st, or October 2021. And to be honest, I just find it kind of appalling that there isn't even an apology that it took them this long to refund people's wildcards. Like, for you to have just made something unusable for, it's 4 months at this point. And, okay, you're going to give people the wildcards finally, but it's, well past time when people should have gotten their refund. So it's good that they're finally correcting it. I just, hopefully this is the last time we ever see something suspended and they just move on to using the rebalancing tools from Alchemy and it's no longer an issue. All right, let's move on to the stuff that I am actually more excited about, which is the changes to all of the cards in Alchemy, and also the changes obviously still carry over into Historic. First off, there's 8 Venture cards that have all gotten a buff. And if you looked at the cards in the Alchemy expansion, one thing that was a notable absence was there were no new cards with the Venture mechanic. That one was kind of left out of the initial wave of Alchemy changes. So it seems like they're trying to make up for that now. They've buffed 8 cards. I'll run through them real quick. Acereric, Cloister Gargoyle, Dungeon Descent, Eliwick Tumblestorm, Fate's Reversal, Find the Path, Precipitous Drop, Triumphant Avenger. I would say the biggest buffs are probably the Triumphant Avenger, which gets a second power, which is a really big deal for that card because it has First Strike and Death Touch, which made it very hard to block, but you could just double block it and you would be able to kill it. So it was very hard to block with a single creature. Any creature you'd block it with would almost always die unless it was indestructible or damage was being prevented somehow. But now that it's got 2 power, you need to have 3 things if you want to be able to block it, and you're going to lose 2 of them just to trade with it. So that makes it a much better creature on attack. Cloister Gargoyle, they reduced a mana from its casting cost, going from 3 mana to 2 mana, really, really huge buff. I don't know if that makes the card great, but it certainly greatly improves it. And then finally, Dungeon Descent, it's one of the biggest buffs you could ever imagine. They took a land that came into play tapped, now it comes into play untapped, and its activated ability, they shaved 3 mana off of the activated ability to go from 4 mana to 1 mana. So that is really just a massive buff to a card that's probably pretty low cost to put in decks. I don't really know that all of this stuff adds up to a Venture deck that's going to be tier 1, but it's certainly enough changes that it all adds up to stuff that's worth trying, so I'm excited to give it a try. I always thought Venture was a little underpowered in the draft format in AFR, but it was fun, so hopefully it's good and constructed. Moving on to Assemble the Parts, this is a card that was in the Alchemy expansion, and this card just never made any sense to me. It still doesn't make any sense. The problem with trying to do a reanimation strategy on Arena is there just aren't good targets to reanimate. The problem isn't that the reanimation spells aren't good enough. There's a 2-mana card, the Priest of, I think, Blood Rites, something like that. In Historic, you can get a 2-mana effect that will reanimate a creature. And the problem is that the best target in Historic is Serra Emissary, which isn't bad, but it honestly isn't good enough to play a reanimation strategy. This really minor improvement to Assemble the Parts, I don't think moves the needle at all. I think if you want people to play reanimation strategies, the reanimation targets have to be better. And honestly, like, creatures are so good now that the kind of creature you could get for 4 or 5 mana, it's just not worth going to the trouble of trying to reanimate something. The card just has to be incredibly good to be worth reanimating, and the creatures on Arena just don't meet that level. Blood Rage Alpha is another card that saw a very minor buff. They added a toughness to it. This is another card that when I saw it, it just doesn't look like a very good card to me. In the Alchemy expansion, I thought that the Geistpack Alpha, I think it's called the Geistpack Alpha, I thought that was a better card than this. I thought Lupine Harbingers was pretty clearly better than this. Adding a toughness to this maybe makes it a card you'd want to put in a sideboard if you were playing some sort of wolf deck and you wanted to have cards that were, a good card in the mirror. Maybe you're interested in this. I'm not sure that you can't do better, to be honest, though. So this doesn't seem like a buff that really moves the needle on this card much at all. Puppet Razor also got another toughness. I don't understand the point of this buff. I actually played with Puppet Razor a fair amount, and it's not a very good card. The missing piece was not a point of toughness. I mean, it was a fun card, so I guess you're taking a card that's fun and you're making it a little better, so it certainly doesn't hurt anything, but in terms of actually making a competitive card, that certainly didn't move the needle there. So overall, the buffs maybe hit with Venture. If I had to guess, I would say they're probably not going to hit, but it certainly moves the needle enough that it's hard to say for sure, and it's interesting to try. The other buffs, I think, were just completely pointless, to be honest. I don't think they make any of those cards any more playable in any measurable way. I mean, they're still just cards. You're going to play them if you're interested in playing a strategy that they enable, but you're not playing them because you think they're the best possible cards to play with. So I don't really see the point in buffing them. Moving on to the nerfs, which I think is where really the action is for Alchemy. there are some really, really impactful nerfs that I think are going to shake things up. First of all, Divide by Zero got a nerf where you're no longer guaranteed to learn. If you're using it on an expensive card, you're not going to get to learn. This is a really huge nerf to the card. I honestly think it might make it so that it's no longer going to see play at all. A little bit, it's going to depend on how the format shakes out. If the format is still really heavy on a lot of 3-mana plays you can target with your Divide by Zero, maybe you would still want to run it. Personally, I think that this is going to cause me to move away from playing Divide by Zero in blue control decks. I'll probably just go back to playing regular counters. Fearsome Whelp got a nerf, and the thing about Fearsome Whelp was I never thought it was a card that was too good, but it was exceptionally annoying. So I can see the point of this nerf. It also got a slight buff, and then it got haste, which I think is an acknowledgement that it actually wasn't that good of a card. It just led to some really incredible starts that where your opponent just felt like they didn't even have a chance to play. So I think overall that's a good change. Hullbreaker Horror got Can't Be Countered removed from it, which I certainly wanted to see this card get a nerf. I wanted to see it get more of a nerf than this, because I think that one of the things that's really annoying about this card is it's so hard to interact with spot removal. Like certainly trying to kill it with sorcery speed removal is almost hopeless. I think they could have made it so that it could not bounce itself back to your hand. And if they had done that and made it counterable, it still probably would have been an okay card. At this point, I think this is where I'm going to look when building control decks, because eventually we'll get to it. Lear also got a pretty substantial nerf. So I think that if you ask me how to build a control deck now, I'm going to be looking at probably blue-white, no Divide by Zero, but Hullbreaker Horror and Witness the Future, or maybe blue-red with Hullbreaker Horror. And honestly, I think blue-red with Auron's Epiphany in Alchemy and Hullbreaker Horror might be the way to go. So this one, it got a nerf, but I think it's still going to see play. Inquisitor Captain got a pretty massive nerf. It no longer works if you're blinking it. It no longer works if you're cloning it. And to be honest, I didn't think that any of the decks that had Inquisitor Captain in them, either in Historic or in Alchemy, were actually top-tier decks. I know some people were having some success with them, but I don't think that that is something that would have lasted as the format continued to get more settled. I think that the power of the Inquisitor Captain was it was so good against other creature decks, but it's really hard for that to just stay as a top deck, because your deck's just not very good against sweepers. Your deck's not very good against counters because you're so reliant on resolving a 4-mana sorcery speed creature. I do think that the card was kind of oppressive in Historic in that it was so easy to put 10 power into play on turn 3 with it, which made trying to attack with small red creatures on the ground or something was just completely impossible. So I do think it needed a nerf. Unfortunately, this is probably the cleanest way they could change the card, but I also think they nerfed it to the point of pretty much being unplayable in Historic. I guess you can still probably try to play it in Alchemy, maybe with Reckless Stormseekers as one of your best hits. I don't think that's going to be a top deck, but it's not inconceivable that that would be a viable deck. Overall, I think that's a big enough nerf for me that I'm probably not going to try the card very much in decks going forward. Moving on to Lear. Lear is a card that I thought 100% needed to be nerfed in Alchemy. The printing of Key to the Archive and Discover the Formula both kind of took Lear, which was already an extremely good card, and pushed its power level through the roof. So I think it needed to be nerfed. This is a really harsh nerf to it because it means that your opponents are going to be able to kill it probably on their turn. Pretty much the only way you're going to be able to reliably protect it is, with Valorous Stance from your hand, or maybe Fading Hope. Think Snakeskin Veil, something like that. you can potentially protect the Lear with, but that really diminishes its value a lot. Also, Lear is really hurt by the Divide by Zero nerf, because Divide by Zero is one of the cards you just always played with Lear. And if Divide by Zero is no longer as useful, then, Lear just takes splash damage from that as well. I would guess that at this point, Lear is not going to be in top tier Alchemy decks. Moving on to Sanguine Brushstroke, they nerfed it in the way that I had actually suggested in a previous video I made, where they just toned down the life gain from it a little bit so that aggro decks are potentially going to be able to actually push through and deal enough damage to kill a Sanguine Brushstroke deck, which was really hard to do before. I think that this is just a good change. It sort of seemed like the format had solved the Sanguine Brushstroke decks to an extent, in that people had figured out control decks that were good against them, and I think people had figured out aggro decks like the Red-Green Werewolves deck, where it was just a lot of haste creatures with relatively high toughness, and that was probably okay against the Brushstroke decks. If Brushstroke falls off in popularity and it gets toned down a little bit, maybe White Weenie can actually succeed in Alchemy. That's something I'll be interested in trying the Brushstroke decks again, and also in trying White Weenie decks. I think that's it's a good change. Final Alchemy card that got a nerf is Townraiser Tyrant, and so now it can only target non-basic lands, which this is honestly barely a nerf at all. It's pretty hard to play a mono deck or a monocolored deck in Alchemy with the nerfed version of Faceless Haven. It just doesn't make very much sense, because it's pretty easy to get enough good dual lands in your deck to play 2 colors. So this is barely a nerf at all. The one thing that's missing from the announcement is any announcement that they're actually going to fix the UI problems with Townraiser Tyrant, which it doesn't say that they're not going to fix them. This is just a post about the rules text change to the card. Hopefully we're going to see a patch relatively soon that causes Townraiser Tyrant to just behave better, where you get a stop in your upkeep before the trigger resolves, and also where the prompt is clearer, so that you're not accidentally sacking your land when you don't want to. One other change is Teferi Time Raveler is coming back to Historic. It's pretty heavily nerfed. Adding 1 to the casting cost of a card is always going to be a pretty big nerf, and also the passive ability only affects your opponent on your turn, which is a very big nerf as well. Honestly, I think Teferi would be fine in Historic if it was just in its original unnerfed form. I don't think it would be overpowered. I just think it's an obnoxious card. So I wouldn't want it to be a mainstay in the format, so it's not like I think it should have been unbanned in its original state. I think in this state, maybe some decks will have some amount of interest in it as like a sideboard card. One of the things that happened when it was banned in Historic is the Kethis combo got a lot worse, because you could no longer just bounce your opponent's Grafdigger's Cage with a card you could easily have in your deck. And, now you could board in a Teferi Time Raveler as your answer to Grafdigger's Cage. So there may be some, niche uses for it, and it'll see a little bit of play. I don't think it's going to be as oppressive as it was when it was in Standard, and I don't think it's going to really be that heavily played. So overall, I guess that's a kind of cool buff, in that you're taking a card that we couldn't use at all and you're making it, fringe usable. That's probably a good goal for these Alchemy changes. So I'm going to say that was a good change. Overall, I think that these changes are good enough to get me excited to play Alchemy again, but it's not. I think they probably could have gone farther, to be honest. I'm kind of surprised to not see Key to the Archive get a nerf. I think that the one thing that Key to the Archive should have had nerfed is Time Warp should have just been removed from the spellbook. That was just the dumbest card imaginable whenever you hit it. It's if people stop playing with Lear, hitting Time Warp does get less good. I mean, it's still just an amazing card to hit off of the key. I know a lot of people wanted Approach of the Second Sun removed from the Spellbook of Key to the Archive. I think that that one card was not a good card to get, so I don't know that you really would have been nerfing the card to remove it. But I do know that people found it really annoying to play against if you were trying to play a mid-range deck and the Key to the Archive deck just plays Approach of the Second Sun on turn 5. A lot of times you just can't win. Realistically, I think those were games where you probably weren't going to win anyway, but it was definitely a pretty big feel-bad moment for people, I know. So I would have certainly been fine with seeing them remove Approach of the Second Sun and just replacing it with Teferi's Protection. I think Teferi's Protection probably actually would be a better card to have in the spellbook for the people playing with Key. And so that would have probably actually been a slight buff, but I think it would have made the card more fun to play against. So I think that that's it for the changes for me. Overall, I'm going to, I guess, give it a grade of like C, C+. I don't think that these are amazing changes, but I don't think they're bad changes either. And I'll be working on some new alchemy decks for sure in the coming days, so stay tuned to see what those are going to look like. Thanks. Bye.